Hello to a beginner's guide to Dark Ages Vampire. I'm not gonna lie to you, I think that Dark Age Vampire is the best setting that White Wolf ever made. I think it's honestly probably the most complete setting. And it might be better than their modern day setting, simply because you know what's gonna happen historically. And so there's not a whole lot of where do we take the story next kind of vibe. I don't secret that I really hate all of the things that they did with Vampire when they've tried to bring it back. I hate most of the story beats since the Anniversary Edition. I've pretty much hated everything that they've written for lore that takes place after the old World of Darkness ended. And that's mostly, it's all really stupid. I'm not gonna lie to you and say that, oh man, it's well written and well put together, because most of the ideas that came out after just don't work, in my opinion. The whole concept behind, oh, now there's a second Inquisition, except nobody knows about it, or oh yeah, we're just gonna dismantle the Sabbat and make it so there's no, faction dynamic, or we're gonna try to be, super edgy for no reason, and, attach real-world events to vampires. It's just a whole lot of awful things that compound one after the other. And you don't have that problem with Dark Ages Vampire, because you're dealing with stuff from thousands of years ago. But it also means that you get to have a lot more fun, and you aren't as restricted. For a number of reasons. One, because you're so far in the past, you now get to play with much more powerful vampires. You also don't have to deal with the Masquerade as much, because depending on when you set it, you may or may not have to deal with the Masquerade. Which means you can just have vampires that are just open about their vampiric nature and moving around mortal society. If you really do an Inquisition game where everyone has to be super paranoid about Inquisitors, you can do that. But if you want to run a game where your vampires are all essentially open about their, condition, and they're operating, just behind members of the nobility, you can do that. Dark Age Vampire, where vampires are prominent members of the clergy. It's a setting where some vampires rule as kings and princes openly and are public figures. It is a setting where you don't have to worry about the world ending, although characters might think it is. It's a setting where you can, as I said, play around with much lower generation vampires and much more powerful abilities. It's a setting where you can kind of stretch your wings and really explore sort of dark fantasy. Because Dark Empire has almost as many source books as modern fantasy vampire. And they're all just as good. They're all just as well written. And there's lots of wonderful information. Now, as I said before, the rule about lore is, the lore is wonderful, fuck the lore. So if you want to just throw out bits of lore that you don't like, by all means go ahead and do that. Especially when you're dealing with historical stuff. If you don't like XYZ, don't include it. You want to change things, by all means go ahead and do it. What I'm trying to get at is that Dark Ages Vampire is a complete setting, and it has lots of wonderful information about basically everything in Europe. So if you need to know, Iberia, you can do that. If you need to know about, England, there's at least 2 source books on medieval England. Okay? You, as a player, are probably going to find that you can get away with a lot more in Dark Ages Vampire. Also add that there are clans that exist in Dark Ages Vampire that don't exist in Modern Knights Vampire. So if you want to play a Salubri, you want to play a Cappadocian, those exist in Dark Ages Vampire. They do not exist in modern day Vampire. Because both of those lines have been extinguished. Most probably. So you don't really have to worry about that. But yeah, if you want to play those, you can in Dark Ages, which is much easier than if you were trying to play them in Modern Knights. I will say that, as of an aside, it's a little sad that they didn't flesh out Victorian Age Vampire the way they did Dark Ages. Because everyone thinks about the Victorian Age when they think vampire, for the most part. Like, Dracula is a Victorian Age story, okay? And it's a little sad they didn't give nearly as many source books about the Victorian Age. They did the Dark Ages. But luckily, the Dark Ages are a wonderful time to play a vampire story. Now, there are a few caveats, there are a few drawbacks, namely that a lot of things in Dark Age Vampire are sort of set in stone, by which lots of older vampires still exist, and they're in positions of power where your vampires are probably not going to be able to take over for them. Okay, you're not going to be able to be like, I want to rule England because there's a 4th generation Ventrue ruling over England. Okay, you're not going to be able to easily carve out domains and things if that's your character's goal. The other problem is that, unfortunately, the medieval period is pre-Camarilla, and so there isn't the kind of, like, how do I put this? There's not this kind of equality between clans. You have the low clans and the high clans, and basically you can think of a caste system where different bloodlines are treated differently. So, like, the Ventrue and the Toreador and the Bruja are all high clans, meaning that their nobility, okay, their bloodlines carry status, and they carry prestige. If you're a Nosferatu or a Malkavian, or, you know, one of the low clans, you're dirt, basically. And in some cases, the high clans will just exterminate you. Just because. Now, obviously, this opens up a lot of role-playing, opportunities. Because, how do you interact with, other players? If you're a Ventrue, you might have other players that are playing some of the low clans. And it's like, well, why would we treat you as our equals? But if you're a low clan, you can kind of use that, oh, I really hate those, those high clans. I hate how uppity they are. I hate how they treat us like we're lesser beings. You can kind of run with that. You can also run with the fact that there's a lot of open space. Okay, there's a lot fewer mortals. There's a lot more wars going on everywhere. There's a lot, it's a lot harder to be a vampire. In Modern Knights, you have the thing where it's like, oh, you have a city, and the city has like 5 million people. And so it's like, feeding is easy. There's lots of, opportunities. Vampires aren't really competing with one another. In the Dark Ages, vampires compete with one another all the time. Okay, and there's an upper limit. There's an upper limit to how many vampires there can possibly be, because you're all going to be competing with one another for blood, and for herd, and for, political favors and things like that. There's another good thing about Dark Ages Vampire, and that's that if you're a storyteller, you can run lots of different games. Okay? Modern Vampire, for better or worse, kind of locks you into a very specific theme, where it's a lot harder to run, like, I don't want to say nomad games, but basically, in Modern Vampire, most vampires are locked into, like, whatever city they're in. So, if you're doing, I don't know, New York by night, you're sort of locked in to always being in New York. Okay? You can leave, but it's really hard. Which seems kind of weird when you think about it, but the reason is that, like, because there's faction-on-faction warfare vampires are sort of locked into wherever they are simply because it's not safe to go anywhere else. Like, if you leave the place that you're established, you know, if you're a Camarilla, there's Sabbat out there. And if you're Sabbat, there's Camarilla out there. And they both want you dead all the time. In the Dark Age, news and information travels more slowly. And so vampires are moving around, you know, oftentimes without the people who own the domain even knowing. You know, a vampire might show up in somebody's domain and leave by the time that, you know, the vampire who owns the domain actually knows that they were there. But it means that vampires will travel much more widely. Okay, this is the era of the Crusades, and there are vampires who, in fact, go on crusade. So if you're a storyteller, and you're like, you know, okay, we want to run a game where our players are traveling the Silk Road, or they are traveling to the Holy Land, or traveling back from the Holy Land having been sired there, you know, we want to run a game where they have to travel through Europe and survive all of the dangers that come along with it. You can do that, okay? And it's much easier than if you were trying to do it in a modern context. Because in a modern context, it's like, oh, everybody has satellites. Everybody has, like, cell phones. If you move into somebody else's domain, they know immediately that you've done so. Okay? They have tracked you and know your location, and, you know, there's no getting around it. There's no, like, oh, I can just do it and no one's going to know. Vampire, you can have vampires scheming under the same place and not know it. Okay? You can have vampires that are fighting over territory against two different enemies and not even realize that they've claimed the same domain. Okay? Weird stuff like that can happen in Dark Ages Vampire. And from perspective, I think it's easier to roleplay. Especially if you're familiar with, like, Dungeons and Dragons. Like, if you're coming from a different role-playing game, Dark Ages Vampire is probably much easier to, like, run as a player, or even as a storyteller, now that I think about it. Just because the medieval setting is sort of familiar to most players of fantasy games. But I want to circle back really quickly and talk about the fact that there's no masquerade for the most part. Now, I know that the masquerade is the first tradition, but it's worth noting that the traditions in Dark Age Vampire are not uniformly, meaning that depending on whose domain you're, like, actually in, depends on what traditions, if any, are being enforced. Most vampires usually pay lip service to them, especially the domain and destruction ones, but the masquerade may or may not be enforced. Like, there's places where the masquerade is strictly enforced, or, you know, there's other places like Eastern Europe where the masquerade is not enforced at all, and the fiends basically openly rule with flesh golems roaming the countryside. And players get to, you as players get to decide, okay, well, how does this affect my character? To put some contrast on it, in Modern Knights, if you get sired as a vampire, you essentially have to leave your old life behind. Okay? You can't really do your job as a vampire because people might find out. You're immediately, like, removed from your old way of living. In Dark Ages Vampire, you can essentially keep doing what you were doing most of the time. Like, if you're a clergyman and you're sired, you might continue being a clergyman, and nobody will complain about this. You know, if you're, like, a nobleman, you might continue just being a nobleman. That just might be a thing that goes on. Like, always the case, if you end up as a Nosferatu, you're probably not going to be able to continue your life. If you end up as, like, a Malkavian, again, you're probably not going to be able to continue your life. But it's feasible for a lot of vampires to just continue on as they were before they were sired. And that changes how the game is played. because your characters have more to lose than just their own lives. They might have to worry about, well, what happens if I lose my position? It's everything to me. But also, you can kind of invest more deeply in their stories from before they were sired. One of my main complaints with Modern Vampire is that it doesn't really allow for a lot of deeply held beliefs in vampires. Like, because we're modern people and we tend to view things like deep-seated religious beliefs as being kind of quaint or sort of out there, it can be hard to kind of roleplay a character that's attracted to lifestyle. Okay? Like, we would view a vampire that is a deeply held Christian as a sort of weird thing. Because it's like, well, I mean, yeah, you might believe in God, but you're an undead monster. You know, that's kind of weird. Like, you're still going to church and still doing all these things. In Dark Ages, that's not weird at all. In fact, that's the norm. In fact, in Dark Ages, a majority of vampires, assuming they're not pagans, are, you know, deeply religious. And there's a lot of deeply held religious conflicts. In fact, one of the main conflicts in Iberia is the Reconquista. And it's being fought between two different factions of La Sombra. There's the Muslim La Sombra, and there's the Christian La Sombra, and they hate each other because they both are clinging onto their mortal religious beliefs. That doesn't exist in Modern Vampire. It exists all over the place in Dark Ages Vampire. Sort of play around with that. Like, how do you navigate your faith with your new condition? Do you navigate your faith with your new condition? Do you abandon your faith? Do you pay lip service to it? Do you sort of end up going through the motions, or do you become more devout? You know, there's a lot of opportunities here. Now, the last major thing I need is true faith, because it's a major aspect of Dark Ages Vampire. So you're probably thinking, okay, you know, it's the Dark Ages, we don't have to worry about the masquerade as much. We could all roll up 5th generation vampires and basically be gods. And there's nothing anyone can do about it, right? Wrong, because true faith exists. Now, practically speaking, in terms of game mechanics, true faith is a get-out-of-jail-free card for the storyteller. In terms of players, it's kind of a, how do I put this? It's a hurdle you have to deal with. So to give you some kind of perspective on true faith, my favorite example of this is, in England, the ruler is Mithras, and he single-handedly conquered Britain when the Romans came. He single-handedly defeated the werewolves, and he shoved back the Fae, and he basically conquered the islands and proclaimed himself king vampire of the entire region. And he has been uncontested there for centuries. In the current time period of Dark Ages Vampire, the current ruler is King John. Now, you may know King John from such tales as Robin Hood. You may know him from the Shakespeare play. You may know him from being forced to sign the Magna Carta. And he's the one that Mithras is backing. Not because he's the best person for the job, not because Mithras has any expectations for him, not because Mithras even likes him, but because Mithras, a 4th generation Ventrue, could not dominate King Richard the Lionheart, a mortal man. Okay, consider perspective on this. Okay, he is 3 steps away from Cain. Okay, he personally knew his progenitor of the entire clan. Okay, he knew his antediluvian. He is a god made flesh. He personally, single-handedly defeated hundreds of werewolves, okay, to conquer Britain, and has ruled uncontested for numerous centuries. And yet, despite all of this power, he is unable to dominate the mind of a single mortal man. Okay, he cannot dominate Richard the Lionheart because Richard the Lionheart has true faith, which makes him extremely dangerous. In setting, faith is sort of an anachronism. It's sort of a thing that most people don't have because faith has been kind of removed from the equation with how much science we have. Whereas in the Dark Ages, faith is everywhere. Faith is a major part of public and private life. Okay, and piety, true faith, is extremely dangerous. At the current timeline, or I guess period that Dark Age Vampire takes place in, you have not yet gotten to the Inquisition, which is a time period where true faith runs rampant and lots of very powerful vampires all meet their deaths because of it. We're not there yet, but true faith is still a problem, and true faith can take many forms. For example, it can be as simple as like Richard the Lionheart, where he is essentially immune to vampiric disciplines. It can take the form of a person exudes a holy aura, and anyone who gets close to it who is undead will be destroyed. It can take the form of any weapon that this person wields does extra damage to the undead. Okay? Think about, like, saints. Okay? Think about, like, what miraculous powers they are allegedly, supposedly meant to have, like, possessed. And now take all that literally to the game world. Okay? You're dealing with people who, if you even got close to them, you might be destroyed, no matter what generation you are, no matter how many years you have. And so most vampires, correctly, try to avoid these people. But then you have to ask a question. Okay, so let's say there's a particularly pious lord. Okay, and your vampires don't like him because he is causing them problems. He is interfering with their business, and you want him gone. How do you get rid of him? Like, you could kill him, but he might end up as a sainted figure, and all of a sudden you might end up with more people who are now, like, even more devout because of it. Like, how do you deal with that? Okay, like, do you try to, like, seduce him? Do you try to, like, find his weakness and try to exploit that so he becomes less faithful? You know, what do you do? The same is true for, like, certain areas that are, like, more consecrated. So, like, various churches, which possess individuals that have true faith. Hunters are obviously in existence, although they aren't as numerous as they will be in the Inquisition. But also think about, like, okay, if you're a vampire and you were particularly religious, and now people with true faith are essentially toxic to you, essentially dangerous to your person. What do you do in that situation? How do you handle that? How do you rationalize your beliefs with, you know, this sort of, like, situation? How do you rationalize, okay, I believe in God, but now all of these people who believe in God are now going to destroy me if I get anywhere near them, you know? The point I'm trying to make, a lot of things you can consider, and obviously true faith being sort of a get-out-of-jail-free card means that the storyteller can just pull it whenever they need to, but I feel like that's also kind of rude. I feel like most of the time you should only pull true faith if you're trying to, like, protect something that's super important, or you're trying to make a plot point. Okay? So, like, if you're really trying to, like, hammer home a problem that you don't want your players to just brute force, true faith is a good way to do it. True faith is also a great way to kind of get around a lot of other issues, is the best way I can put it. Like, I don't want you to go here. Oh, if you go here, you'll start, like, burning and taking damage because somebody there is praying and they have true faith, and that protects them. Anyway, Dark Ages Vampire. There's not a whole lot more to talk about without getting into, like, deep lore or mechanics, and I don't really want this to be that. This is sort of an overview of what Dark Age Vampire is and the differences between it and Modern Knights. I think I've covered basically everything. If you're at all interested, I would recommend checking out the source books because they're really well written and they're really fun to read. And if you're interested in running a game, I would say absolutely go for it. It can be somewhat easier than running a Modern Knights game just because you have to worry about a lot less. Sometimes you have to worry about a lot more, but by and large, you don't have to deal with as many problems, is the way I would put it. So yeah, that's Dark Ages Vampire. Go check it out.